also was talking about. So now we have quite a plenty of time for questions, and we will collect, and then we'll have all the speakers to reply. So I saw Hiroyaki, but please, how do we have? No, I think you have to talk to the mic, because otherwise there will be no translation.
We have a couple of rounds.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So we don't have all the questions.
Yeah, we'll give this.
Yeah.
And I do not see any other hands. Okay, see a couple. Oh, quite a many. So Hiroyaki, please go ahead.
I have a question for Mark and a question for Andrzej. When we think about the Soviet period, the most popular geopolitician was Karl Haushofer. Karl Radek was a great fan of Haushofer. And Karl Haushofer.
Right.
Yeah.
He was a fan of who? Who was a fan of
Karl Radek. Karl Radek. So Carl Schmitt, I'm not quite sure how he was perceived at the time of the Soviet period. So I wonder how Karl Haushofer fits into this scheme of Soviet Russian conception of geopolitics. The question for Andrzej, I think what you seem to mean is that Putin wants the United States to get out of Europe. Then probably we can manage. Germany, France, wow, we couldn't. NATO will break down and so on. Yes. But my question is, if we look at the history of Eastern Europe, it's a disaster. Russian Empire collapsed. Part of the reason was that Russia incorporated part of Poland, which is a totally different historical experience. In a sense, Poland destabilized the Russian Empire. Okay, after the Russian Empire collapsed, the Soviet Union came in, and then Soviet Union again incorporated much of Eastern Europe, including Poland, after 1945. And again, it failed, 1989, 1991. So, okay, even if Putin manages to kick the US out of Europe and then hold Eastern Europe under its control, I wonder how promising it is. All of Eastern Europe wanted to join NATO, not because United States may have wanted them to join, but the impetus came from Eastern Europe. So maybe Putin is too optimistic or too arrogant. I'm not quite sure how he conceives of the future of Europe. Thank you.
Okay. No, first here and then you.
Thank you so much.
Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yes,
okay?
I'm Rainis from the Latvian Embassy. So thank you for having me and also for the invitation. It was very, very interesting. Due to the fact that I am also partially with a historical education and know a few things about this, so to say, I would have a question specifically to Mark and also to Andrzej regarding the mindset of the Russian vastness of this Großraum ideology that they have and that they still retain, in the sense that due to while they have this mentality of a very large, vast, and basically inconceivable a Russia without borders, so to say, there still is this, I would say, basically contradicting fact that they also have the notion that Russia's main strength lies in its weakness, basically saying, due to the fact that Russia is so strong, it becomes weaker, And at the same time, due to the fact that Russia is weak in the sense of economical growth or population or military strength, to have to rely on raw masses to achieve victories throughout history, that in this notion of weakness lies its strength, that it can rapidly overcome odds. My question would be, in this sense, how this also relocates and correlates, for example, with how Putin stylizes would look on the Russian historical views of imperial Russia and of the Soviet Russia, how Putin uses these both concepts to basically give them a new spin, to make them attractive for the current generation. Thank you.
I'm Volodymyr Sklokin, and thank you for the fascinating papers. And I have a question to Professor Novak and to Professor Zorin. So to Professor Novak, I'm curious about the conceptual history of the term Eastern Europe in Russia and in Russian language. So could you elaborate when did it emerge as a term in Russian language, and when did it acquire this imperialistic dimension? So whether it was in the 18th century or later in the 19th century. And my question to Professor Zorin, could you say a few words about the place of Ukraine in this special imagery of Tolstoy?
Okay, actually, I was going to ask similar question to Professor Zorin. What's the Russian proper in the Tolstoy understanding? Not only Ukraine would be important in this case, but whether the Russia proper ends with regard to the Western dimension.
Hello, my name is Michał Orzechowski. I'm a freelance journalist and human rights activist, and I'm also a licensed anti-communist because I have the badge from Polish Minister of being the member of the anti-communist opposition. So first of all, I want to congratulate, and my questions are supportive to your job. I was also at the first conference. I was also 2008 in Georgia, and I'm going now Ukraine. So I'm like a practice anti-Russian. So first of all, if it would be not good, because any discussion which is not very nice to Russia is of course Russophobia, wouldn't be good to propose that this what we are doing is a Russology, that we are here Russologic, like a new term which will be like counter any accusation of being Russophobic or anti-Russian, that we especially countries from the Central East Europe, we know Russia, and we are worse than Russophobic. We are Russologic. It's like a proposition. The second thing, Poland for a long time was fighting to not use the term of Nazi in context of the Second World War, but especially Nazi Germany. So it was a specific nation and state which was making all these crimes. So I would like to also ask if it would be not a good thing to all the time, every time, speak about Soviet Russia, including your title, because in this title we have two countries, Russia and Soviet. And Russians, every time they do something bad and they change the system or the Tsar or they destroy, they come, no, it was, now it's totally different. Now it's Russia. We have nothing in common with Soviet. It was so all the time to underline Soviet Russia. It was, the language was Russian, the capital of Moscow or Petersburg, and it was just one of the evolution of the Russian state, Tsar, communist, or again now neo-authoritarian. And just to finish, I always think if it's a very good job what you're doing, and this is not against it, but it's always for me very it's a big question if it's good to take Russians seriously, because they always use all kind of terms, right wing, left wing, just useful. So they are very opportunistic with using all kind of ideology and values. And I will just give you some examples from the history. They're always defenders of Slavic, And they're always very happy to destroy Poland and other Slavic countries with Germans. This is very one. They are defenders of Orthodox Christianity, and they have no problems to attack Georgia and Ukraine Orthodox countries. And for example, they accuse all other about fascism, and they are first to cooperate with Hitler and Nazi Germany. There was a very good documentary from Baltic States, Soviet story. And they all accuse all other countries about anti-Semitism. And please just remember that the word pogrom, it's a Russian word made by Russians. So thank you. That's my questions.
Okay. Okay, a couple of additional questions and then we'll stop.
Thank you. Just short question. My name is Alexander Avramchuk, Catholic University of Lublin. I have a short question to Professor Novak and Professor Basing. So indeed, the spectre of Yalta is in the air, surely. And my question is, what is the new imaginary lines, so to speak, what is the new Iron Curtain? Is it Narva Ismail, that is Slavic Rus, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus? Is it Kaliningrad Ismail, that is encompassing also Baltic states, or is it set in Trieste as it was in following World War II? So thank you.
Yeah, that maybe I'll stop here. I saw a couple of other questions, but then maybe we'll have a second round. So my question to Andrzej was very similar. What's Eastern Europe in the Moscow's understanding? It's a fluctuating term that it changes all the time, or we have a stable borders in that geo-imaginary? So Mark, maybe you want that first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. On the Soviets and Karl Haushofer, I think there are two parts to the answer. You mentioned Radek, and yes, this is the very early sort of Bolshevik, still Bolshevik leadership, and there was a very direct connection. He knew Haushofer. I think he published in the Zeitschrift für Geopolitik. Possibly Haushofer was extremely interested in that, but he was very interested in the Soviet Union. He was very interested in the Asian turn of this pretension that the early Bolsheviks had, Lenin had after the revolution, to be a leader of Asia. This propagandistic move to try to gather support in the colonial, what was still the colonial Asia, the European colonies. And he noted that, and he was, in that sense, very interested, I would say above all, Haushofer, in Russia, in Eurasians, the Eurasianists, these Yevrazitsi, who were active, some of them were active in Berlin and in Germany, and he connected with them, and he did publish articles in the Zeitschrift für Geopolitik about Eurasianism, which he was very fascinated by. He didn't support it. He was very anti-Soviet in that sense. He was very anti-Russian. But he was very appreciative of this, and he viewed Eurasianism as a model ideology of what he called, and he published a pamphlet on this in 1931, Geopolitik der Pan-Ideen, these pan ideas, these kind of what we would call a kind of identity, continental identity politics today, and the geopolitical implications. And in a sense, Eurasianism was a very good example of what he was talking about. So there's very strong interest. And then, of course, Haushofer was the fervent supporter of what Andrzej talks so much about, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, believing that this was the sort of, and it wasn't a question of allying with Russia or the Soviet Union and feeling sort of an alliance with it, but rather a division of Europe, according to these two Großräume. This was, in a sense, the Hitler-Stalin Pact for Haushofer was finally, he saw this as the kind of breakthrough into actual politics of this principle of Großraum. The second part to the answer, though, is the point that I made, and this is the fact that after 1945, I guess maybe I should have been more specific in saying that the banishment of geopolitics from Soviet thinking was really after the war, perhaps understandably in terms of the role that the geopoliticians in Haushofer played in supporting the Nazi regime. And so then Haushofer at this point would have been sort of a proscribed figure, as were the other geopoliticians, and then Dugin would have learned about him, as I said, through his connections with the European neo-fascists. But Haushofer today, for Dugin, is actually extremely important, And in some recent research, I mean, the Schmidt is very obvious to anyone who reads Haushofer. You'll see Schmidt right away. Haushofer is a little bit more to the side, but still, he's actually also very important and in a remarkable kind of way. And this is one of the reasons I emphasized in the beginning of my paper how accurate Dugin is and how well he knows this rather complicated and convoluted legacy of this interwar theorizing, is that he also engages with these, I won't go into detail, but he also engages with these ideas of Haushofer. So I think that point was very well taken. On the question about Russia's vastness, yes, indeed. I mean, this is an old trope in Russian cultural history, really. It goes way back. I don't have anything to say. It's a very interesting point you raise about sort of strength from weakness and connecting this to the spatial expanse. I don't quite know what to make of that. I think it's a very interesting idea. I haven't seen it being developed, but it's certainly an interesting one. I mean, what I think is linked to that in a way, maybe this is partly what you had in mind, this notion of Russia being boundless. And Putin actually recently made this statement. Putin's become very interested in geography, and he's now become a patron of the Geographical Society, the Russian Geographical Society in St. Petersburg. And at I think it was a meeting of young people there some years ago, he said, Russia has no boundaries. I don't really buy that. I don't think that he believes Russia has no boundaries. I mean, this is obviously just a propagandistic sort of statement. The question then is to say, well, actually, what boundaries do you think he has? And from that standpoint, I think that what Andrzej has talked about historically is extremely interesting, because you see the variety in the ways that these boundaries can shift from, and the liminal space here can be seen in different directions. And I'm sorry, there was a third question about, and I didn't understand it. I didn't quite hear the question. Something about a new Russian. Can you please? I didn't understand what you were. Could you just?
Iron Curtain, new Iron Curtain, where it is, where it is now, according to Putin.
According to Putin. Well, he would like it to be. Well, this is a question. I wanted to actually come back and ask you about this. This is the big, exactly where do these boundaries lie? And I see it, but maybe I'm not completely correct here. I mean, I see it as neo-Soviet revanchism. I see what is immediately in his head now is thinking about what the Soviet Union was and what the boundaries of the Soviet Union were. So you have Ukraine, of course, is at the center there, and how far that's not going to he won't be successful there, at least as much as he would like to be successful. The Baltic states then come into question from this standpoint, I would say very acutely, as well as Central Asia. Exactly what's going on there. Although Central Asia, now things have really changed because you have China as an actor, a very important actor there. So that's changed. To what extent this extends beyond that, I think it's absolutely something we have to think about. I don't quite know, what that would be. And I'm not sure that Putin himself has a kind of a fixed idea about exactly what he would like that to be.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Just to add to that question about vastness, just recently, Benjamin Schenk published an article about Russian imagination of a space as 1/6 of the Earth. The article was published in Kritika and the US journal.
Thank you very much. There were many interesting questions. But first, I would like to express my gratitude to my distinguished colleagues from the panel for so many, so to speak, food for thinking. And continuing that gratitude, I would like to start with a question to Professor Zorin, or two questions, actually. You stated that you consider Leo Tolstoy the most anti-imperial of Russian writers. I would have jokingly enumerate a contemporary writer, which I like very much, Sergei Lebedev, maybe might be a rival in this respect. But going more seriously, I would ask for your answer to critiques of that stand, as expressed first by Eva Thompson in her book, and later by Edyta Bojanowska in her also interesting study. I'm quite curious about your take on these critics of Tolstoy. Orientalism, colonialism, that's rather how Bojanowska treats his point. But going back to questions addressed to myself, Hiroaki, Professor Kuromiya simply observed that Eastern Europe is a source of many crises for Russian Empire. That's why how to understand this ever recurring will to take it again as a source of troubles. Actually, there is a very interesting anthology of Russian geopolitical thinking prepared by people named Zinoviev. I forgot their Christian names. It was published some 15 years ago, and it is exactly under the title of a chapter on Eastern Europe, which is called A Black Hole of Russian Empire. This empire always stumbles on Eastern European problems, being Polish problem in the 19th century, and towards the end of the 20th century and early 21st, it is Ukrainian problem, more or less. So yes, there is this paradox, and I'm sorry, but I have no answer to it. So thank you just for observing this paradox. Maybe Vladimir Putin has an answer, and we will look how it develops. But I will go back to other questions where the same problem will arise. The question about Russian vastness and weakness stemming from this extensive way of development reminds me two stages of Putin's, so to speak, ideology. The original ideology, as he presented from the very year 2000, was to intensify Russian internal development rather than to continue this extensive way of living. So he was proponent of liberal economic reforms and so on and so forth, and it seemed to be the motto of the beginning of his rule, according to many observers. However, in the second stage, he took the banner of anti-imperial imperialism. We are robbed of our possibilities to develop intensively by these greedy imperialists from the West, especially the US, who takes our resources. So the greatness of our space and its untouchability, so to speak, is the necessary condition for us to survive and to intensify our life. That's how I see this, so to speak, evolution or revolution in the state ideology under Putin between 2000 and 2020, so to speak. However, they are united by the same logic of, well, I would say Chadaev tradition, that if not that greatness, Russia would be nothing, or at least would not be possible to be as important in different fields as it is without that territorial greatness. As regards simple and yet very interesting and difficult at the same time question of Professor Squawking about the beginnings of the use of the term Eastern Europe in Russian, my, so to speak, source studies show Vasily Tredyakovsky from the first half of 18th century as one of the first, a poet contemporary to Mikhail Lomonosov, to use that category, though not completely or exactly the word itself. The word itself would develop very soon in the second half of the 18th century in Russian poetry, which was so well analyzed by Professor Zorin. And I think one metaphor could be used from that analysis by Professor Zorin from Karmia Dwugłowego Orła, from Vasily Pietrov poem written after the second dismemberment or partition of Poland, the metaphor of napierśniki Rosji, that is antemurale of Russia. Europe is antemurale of Russia, according to a bulwark of Russia, a kind of borderland march in that imagination. And here I am trying to answer the question both of Dr. Avramchuk and Professor Staliunas. Where is this Iron Curtain now? I think that it has at least two, so to speak, zones or two incarnations. One is the Soviet Union borders, just as Mark Basin stated, this is a kind of neo-Soviet revanchism. But there is also this larger dimension that covers the former Eastern Bloc as a kind of external borderland, external march that should be influenced or even controlled by Russia, not as a part of Russia, but as a part of Russian zone of, so to speak, well-being in relations with the West. So that's how I would use or reuse that concept of napierśnik Rosji. This is the second line of that Iron Curtain now. If there are any, oh yes, Soviet and Russia. Actually, that state, which I referred to in part of my presentation, was called Soviet Russia between 1917 and 1922. So it united these two elements in the state official, so to speak, name. This union was very shaky, very difficult, but at the same time, especially Stalin during these years between 1917 and 1922, developed a very, I would say, consequent ideology linking the two, that is presenting necessity of the Soviet element to be grounded in Russian space greatness. I am dealing with that subject in my recent book. So probably this is all, maybe not all. I'm sorry if I have not answered the questions.
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, one thing which in a way unites most of the questions I got to be probably said before, being anti-imperialist, yeah, and I'll deal with the objections of Professor Thompson and Professor Bayanowska, does not necessarily, there is some implication that if you are anti-imperialist, you are a fan of nation state. Tolstoy was not a fan of nation state, that's very clear. He was a radical anarchist who didn't believe in any state whatsoever. All state was absolutely evil without difference. Yeah, and nation state to Tolstoy was no better than an imperial state. They were both evil roughly on the same level. And that's an essential thing. Thus, it is about the settlers. The important thing is that what makes the land yours is not the laws of the land, is not the government, and it's not ethnicity. Tolstoy was not strong on patriotism, nor on language. He didn't believe it's important. The only thing which is important is physically being on the land, living it, working on it, and being able and ready to die for it and to lay down in it. And that's why the Caucasus belongs both to the Cossacks and to the Chechens. Somehow it is better when they can make an agreement, and Tolstoy was sure that it's possible, like in the Volga steppes, Russians and Bashkirs, he believed, can divide the land. There is an abundance of land, and there is no problem about having it. And he has this story, how much land does the man need? Yeah, and the old Bashkir tells a story, a moral lesson to the Russian merchant who believes he needs a lot of land. No, You don't need a lot of land, and basically people can agree about the land and work in there, and that's much more important than the state to which it belongs. So he didn't see, he knew very well that people move. You leave your own land and you move somewhere else. Like, God told Abraham to leave his land and to go somewhere else. And you go, and you move and you toil the land, and that's the important thing. And you don't put a uniform and in an army, go and fight, and conquer and kill, and that's evil. Whether you're sent there by nation state or by an imperial state. And thus, speaking about Ukraine, it's very difficult. It's not very present on Tolstoy's map. Clearly, he saw Kiev as a very important Russian state, historically. He went there on foot, physically on foot. In his very short Orthodox period, for 2 years, he was an Orthodox, not long. He adopted Orthodoxy and then was completely disenchanted and started working on the religion of his own. But when he was Orthodox, he went to Kiev on foot to pray before the relics of the saints. And he saw it as an old, of course, Russian place, Orthodox or whatever. Whether it should be under Russian Tsar, no. No place on earth should be under Russian Tsar, and especially St. Petersburg shouldn't be definitely under Russian Tsar, or both Russian Tsar and St. Petersburg are evil. And thus, he didn't envisage, of course, Ukraine. He saw, the Polish attachment to Poland. And the insurrections, the deportations, the move of the Polish exiles, and he sympathized with it, but not because, and he said actually to the Poles, he said, yes, you rebel against Russian Empire, and that's very sympathetic, but do you really believe your government is going to be any better? No, it won't. This is an exactly thing. He has a lot of sympathy for their anti-Russian feeling, but not so much sympathy for their nationalist feeling. And the same deals with his attitude to Ukraine. He was, of course, not a nationalist in this ethnic cultural sense of the world. His type of Slavophilism can be explained as the traditional word почвенничество, belonging to the soil, not to the ethnic, religious, political entities. And thus, and it also deals, the question was, what was his attitude to the West? Basically negative, of course. He didn't like Europe, first of all. Europe was not an important place. He didn't believe in political democracy. He said there's in the authoritarian government, there is one advantage before the democratic government, that it is the enemy and you see the enemy. And it doesn't pretend, the authoritarian government. The democratic government pretends it represents the people, which is impossibility. Otherwise, they're exactly similar. But the authoritarian government is more sincere. So that was his attitude to it. But he had some exceptions. He loved America. He's never been there, but he loved America as a non-national country, and which he didn't see as an empire. And this country of land, the attachment, the settlers coming to toil on the land, he had deep sympathy with American abolitionists. He quoted Toro, who refused to pay taxes, and went to jail, refusing to pay taxes to the country which supports slavery. He admired Robert William Lloyd Garrison. He admired Ballou. He was very interested in Henry George. He was very interested in American thinkers, and basically he loved the United States very much. Once even he supported one candidate as a presidency. He said, basically, I don't want any decent people to be president, but still this one would be probably better than anyone else. To the extent he gave some legitimacy to American government, minimal, no legitimacy to any other government. So yes, he was a sort of Americophile. Yeah, once he said about Norway, he said, Norway is my second loved country after United States, after America. He never used the word United States, but after America. Yeah, he also is a wild country with a lot of land, yeah, deep attachment between culture and nature and so on. Yeah, and actually not politically independent in Tolstoy's time. Yeah, it was part of Sweden. But he loved Norway as well. But his main interest, of course, philosophical interest, lay on the East and not on the West. He was interested in Chinese philosophy. Yeah, he read Lao Tzu and Confucius. He was interested in Buddhism and Indian philosophy. In the last year of his life, he corresponded with Mahatma Gandhi. Not yet Mahatma, just Gandhi, yeah, and so on and so forth. So that would be the answer to that question. And well, of course, I think there are anti-imperialist writers today. Yeah, when I mentioned Tolstoy the most, yeah, I spoke about the old time, the times of Russian Empire. Today, yeah, in the time of Putin's aggression against Ukraine, you of course have Russian anti-imperialist writers, but as the Thompson's books and Bayanovsky books, I think Professor Bayanovsky made a wonderful archival work in Samara's archive. I appreciate it very much. But I believe they both these books, and it's not limited to these two books. It's just limited into it's a very strongly feature of today's approach to literature and to the culture of old time, and not only to Russian. You deal with the same one with French literature, English, whichever. Yeah, you have the sort of attitude which is painfully familiar to me as I was educated in good old Soviet times. You have the teaching, единственно верное учение, Marxism-Leninism, the only just teaching, and all writers and are measured accordingly how they work against this universal scale of perfection, which is Marxism-Leninism. And that author didn't недопонял, didn't understand enough. Yeah, the other one, was not up. That could understand something, but not everything, and so on and so forth. And that overcame the rigidities of his surroundings. And that's what I see today in predominant number of Western scholarship dealing with the literature of previous ages. And I am not a fan of this approach. And that's why I see books both by, they have some merits. I think these books, and especially last article by Professor Bayanovsky deals with that. But the traditional approach, he was not, Tolstoy or any other writer was not up to understanding the post-colonial thinking of the 21st century. That's not what which I would subscribe, except apart from that, there are a lot of evident mistakes. Professor Bayanovsky, he knew that Tolstoy idealized Russian peasant, which is of course true, and that's, he said he was he was a fan of peasant commune. Never in his life. He was a fan of peasant commune. He believed in a man working on sort of the land. He didn't believe in property, but as long as you work on your land, it's yours land. And he was never a fan of commune. He's seen a lot of commune in his entire life and described it many times. He was a Henry Georges and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to start our break for coffee, but we still have a couple of questions. So, Mark, you can ask your question, and then I'll pass the mic to Andre.
Andrzej, thank you very much. That was an extremely stimulating, very fascinating
provoking, thought-provoking. Two questions for you very quickly. I mean, you reminded us, it's so incongruous to be reminded of Danilevsky as a pan-Slav, because you can not worry about pan-Slavism and still sort of read him and you think you understand what he's saying. You think you do understand. So the first question quickly, should we understand Russian pan-Slavism, the tradition, not just he's an example, but others, as a hegemonic? Is it always a sort of in this Danilevskian spirit that you talked about of a sort of a natural, not simply a fraternity with other Slavs, a Slavic fraternity or community, but actually one in which you have Russia as a leading power, which is, of course, not necessarily the case in pan-Slavism in other places. So just a sort of point of fact. Secondly, I'd like to push you just a little bit further, and you kind of put yourself in this position, and because you very kind of eloquently described a tradition of thinking, kind of going back to the 19th century and then through the Soviet and then to the post-Soviet with the extensive comments on Putin, ending with your extensive comments on Putin, of Russian, kind of this idea of Russian aggrandizement, this Russian entitlement of one sort or another to a position of control over Eastern Europe. So my question is, so that's clear, okay, well, this tradition you're talking about. My question is this, one step further. Do you see this as a tradition of Russian sort of state thinking, or do you see it as the tradition of Russian state thinking? To what extent, and I mean, this gets back to a little bit what the points I was emphasizing in Dugin's idea about an essentialized opposition, an essentialized kind of conflict. Do you see this as an essentialized element, or is it something in Russian kind of statecraft, in Russian political thinking that one follows as you've done across the centuries? Or what can one also think about it? Well, okay, let me just stop. See if is it A or the in that sense. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Could you please keep your questions concise?
Okay.
Then you.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you first.
Okay. All right. I have this is Curtis Murphy from Astana, which for Tolstoy would be southern Siberia. I had a question for Professor Zorin about the reception to these writings, this geographical imagination of Tolstoy. In other words, to what extent do other Russian thinkers, writers of Tolstoy's period criticize him for his vision that Poland, for example, was not part of Russia, or for the story Zasto that you mentioned? Did this become part of some kind of conversation about the place of Poland in Russian Empire, or is it more just dismissed as another kind of example of Tolstoy's thinking, which I think was already becoming somewhat marginalized, let's say, in the end of his life?
Okay. Thank you. If I may, Alexander Paharelli here. So first, I would like to ask both Professors Basin and Professor Andrzej Nowak. I think that the great elephant in the room concerning the geopolitical thinking, especially in the 19th century, is the thought of certain British thinkers, for example, like Herbert Spencer and Engels, concerning the Slavic peoples as backward and dangerous, and for the progressive German Revolution. In this respect, do you think that the influence, direct or indirect, of Herbert Spencer, who represents certainly the maritime nation and the British Empire, the intellectual strength of the British Empire in the 19th century, is it present in Dugin's thought and in current Russian debates on further territorial expansion, on the secondary nature, or the just a very marginal nature of those small reactionary Eastern European backward nations, which are retarding the progress, which are constantly clinging to their ethnocracies or whatever, which are upsetting the order. And this is the thought which is very clearly present in Herbert Spencer thinking. And Spencer's thinking was instrumental in shaping the views of many ideologues of national revival in Eastern Europe, actually. And my other question I would like to address to Andrei Zorin and Professor Novak. Do you think that the kind of diversity, unity in diversity, which is clearly present in Russian ideologies of imperialism, would justify Russian imperial expansion? Can we find it actually in secondary British and English language writers which were fascinated with Russia, especially those fascinated by Leo Tolstoy and his writing, who were fascinated by traveling around Russia, like, for example, Stephen Graham. Especially his two books, Russia and the World, published in 1915. And his books about traveling around Russia, I guess it's 1909 with Russian pilgrims. And the other books where he describes his travels in Caucasus, Siberia, Urals, and Central Asia. Do they somehow, those maritime writers, those Western writers, somehow justify Russian imperialism? And even today, Russians can cite them as justifying Russian territorial expansion as some kind of progress against those barbarous small nations which are, in their struggles, in their clinging to independence, are upsetting the order and are an obstacle toward the march of modernity or whatever. Thank you.
Okay, very last question or comment.
It's a comment, Igor Kasho, Chisinau National Archives and State University of Moldova. To the question that somebody said, why Russia doesn't have this sense of borders, of geography. This is yours and this is not yours. And I remember when I did my dissertation in the 90s, I was looking in 1989 when the national republics adopted the language laws, imposing the Russian speakers to learn the titular language. And it was a reply, I think in Druzhba Narodov, a Moscow intellectual said, more or less humorously, but very interesting, I think, for our discussion here. He said, what you want, Россия святая, Russian is saint, and what is saint doesn't have geographical limitations. So I think it's a good invitation to look into the religious roots of Russian imperialism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we now start with Andrei Zorin and go backwards.
Okay. One question was, how did Tolstoy's contemporaries react to his position? Of course, the most famous case is the reaction of Dostoevsky, who was a huge Tolstoy admirer. And when he started reading the first chapters and bits of pieces of Anna Karenina, he says, that is finally our argument about our place in European civilization. This book brings us to the summit of humanity. Yeah, and then at the end of the story, when Tolstoy started criticizing the involvement of Russian army in the Russo-Turkish War of 77, and the spirit of bringing up the movement of defending the Serbs and the Bulgarians from the Turks, Dostoevsky became terribly critical of Tolstoy. He was a militarist. He believed in the messianic role of Russian Empire, and the magazine called Русский Вестник, which was the most popular magazine where Anna Karenina was published, stopped the publication. They just didn't publish the last part of it, because they were shocked by Tolstoy, utter criticism of the involvement of Russia in the Balkan War of the 70s. So there were very strong criticisms, yeah, and during Russo-Japanese War, a lot of people criticized him for not taking stand. Yeah, he wrote an article called Bethink Yourself. He said, both Russians and Japanese are taking people from their life and families and sending them to kill each other for the pieces of land they don't need. Yeah, and he said, one says they're Christians and Christians can't kill. The others say they're Buddhists and Buddhists can't kill even an animal. Yeah, and they are going on and fighting there. Yeah, and how he describes the atmosphere of patriotic hysteria in Russian press is shocking. How contemporary it looks if we discuss today's press in Russia. Yeah, and of course, he was attacked and criticized for it many, many, many times. Yeah, and not many people could agree with him. Yeah, and Haji Murat, of course, his most militantly anti-militarist work was never published in his lifetime. Another question is the whole question of imperial diversity, which I think is very apt. I think a lot of empires, not only Russian and British, they celebrate diversity. It's the part of the imperial vision. Yeah, in the 18th century, there was this Ледяной Дом celebrations when all the ethnic groups of Russia were told to send two people in national dress to show how Russian diversity is, and the delegation from Kamchatka arrived in St. Petersburg 18 months after the event. The Tsars didn't realize how much it takes, to send there the ambassadors and to bring people from there, and so on and so forth. But in a way, also using the privilege to ask questions to Mark and Andrei, I see a lot of difference in today's Putin's celebration, this imperial vision of the mission of Russia, and the way how he treats Ukraine and Belarus. He speaks all the time of Trijedиный народ. It's the unified nation which is cut officially into pieces. Yeah, and there are Russian folk tales telling that when is the body of the warrior, of the Bogatych, is cut into pieces, first of all, what you do to revive him, you pour the dead water on the body, and then the body becomes unified. And then you pour the live water, живую воду, and you are resurrected. And what he believes he's doing now is putting the dead water on the dissected body of the unified nation. And thus, I think basically the war in Ukraine is dramatically asymmetric, because for the Ukrainians, it is definitely a clear classical national liberation war. Yeah, it's like from the textbook liberation war, you fight anti-colonial war for national liberation. That's how they see it, how they perceive it, and what it is if you look from that side. From the Russian part of view, it's not so much an imperialist war, at least at the beginning. Now it starts to move at the second year of the war, the ideological, but it is a war for reunification. It's more nationalistic than imperialistic, for the reunification of the unity of the one, basically, nation. And the word Trijedиный is always used, because it's the same which is used in Credo, the nature of God, God Father, God Son, and Holy Spirit is Trijedin. In the same way, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are the same.
I want to remind you that we shouldn't be too imperialistic with our first panel. There are next panels. So I will be very brief because we don't also to take time from our coffee break. Russian Pan-Slavism, is it always hegemonic or there are other versions? It seems to me that sometimes even in poetry, Pushkin could be seen in his To the Slanderers of Russia as one of the forebearers of Pan-Slavism. He's very hegemonic. Just like Herzl in his Russian socialism, which is very much Pan-Slavic in its tones. I would say most of expressions, ideological expressions of Pan-Slavism, it is very difficult to find non-hegemonic Pan-Slavism. When we turn into another question about tradition of Russian thinking, whether there is only one, so to speak, tradition of being especially aggressive towards Eastern Europe, expansionist and so on and so forth. I think there are two variants. One is more ideological, where you can put all the fantasies and change them without any logical conscience. This is an important observation by Simeon Frank from the beginning of the 20th century, that Russians, that's a stereotype, but quite useful, do not have logical conscience. So they could be very postmodern. They could unite absolutely contradictory elements into their ideologies. That was one of the Russians' observation by Simeon Frank. But at the same time, Russia is, to a degree, one can say, normal state, living on normal problems of finance, of resources. So I would say there is also, beside that ideological vision of Eastern Europe, of expansion, or of Pan-Slavism, there is also a pragmatic vision espoused by state representatives. There is a very different perspective of Ministry of Finance, always in the 19th century, in the Soviet Union, and I believe even in Putin's Russia. It's more pragmatic. We should be more, so to speak, restrained in our ambitions. We should count money we have for that or for this. So I would contrast only these two poles of Russian expansionism as, on one side, ideological, with very different ideologies put inside, and more pragmatic, which is tempered a little bit. And on that note, unfortunately, I have to stop.
Okay, well, just very briefly, thank you. I can't comment on Spencer. I am unaware of, I've never seen a reference to him. It's an extremely interesting observation. But to my knowledge, Dugin doesn't discuss him, or at least I'm not aware of that. But it does raise the very interesting question, which I don't want to spend, we don't have time, but just to note it, this land versus sea opposition. And what does this mean for Eastern Europe? That's a very interesting question, because for Dugin and for Schmidt, it was really a question of the Atlantic powers or Britain in that case, very specifically. The division between the division with Germany and the Soviet Union, with the Molotov, which these people were celebrating, this pact was not a pact of land versus sea. These were two continental powers, so that logic doesn't play into that at all. The only place where you can get it, but it's extremely significant, and I'm just going to end on this without talking, and I'll refer to Andrzej's work, and this is the British geopolitician Mackinder. And Mackinder tried to think about, what did this land-sea opposition, where did this leave Europe, and where did it leave Eastern Europe? And it ended up with him elaborating on this bipartite opposition to what is effectively a tripartite model of what he called the heartland, the external, he had a language for it, but what he called the internal crescent, which is effectively what we call Western Europe, but very much including the lands we talk about as Eastern Europe. But that's another question. This is something you should read Andrzej. He's written about that.
Okay, thank you very much. We had a very rich discussion, and we all deserved coffee, which is in that direction as far as I know. So thank you very much.